Let's continue with the 1920s. In the first section, we talked about urbanization, new immigrants, and transportation, including cars and airplanes. Let's move on and talk about some of the other changes going on during this time period. New roles were emerging for women. In the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, giving women all throughout the United States the right to vote. Women began to branch out as far as professions were concerned. More of them became teachers, nurses, and librarians. The first woman admitted to the Medical College of Georgia was a woman named Laurie Florence in 1921. One group of young women were known as flappers, young women who lived on their own. And this was really, really, really different from the way things had been before. Before this, women lived in their parents' house until they got married, and then they lived with their husband. There was not sort of an in between time. Well, flappers were young women who had possibly jobs and lived on their own and had some degree of independence. They cut their hair short, the hemlines crept up, some dresses were even sleeveless, and some Georgians disapproved. This was way too much skin as far as they were concerned. This is Margaret Mitchell, um, the author of Gone with the Wind, who was a flapper when she was in her early 20s. We'll take a look tomorrow at a video from her from the museum from her house, and you should be prepared to learn to dance the Charleston in class. So I'm looking forward to seeing all of you dance the Charleston. It was also a time of change for African Americans. This is still, the Great Migration is still going on. They're moving to get away from segregation and to get jobs in northern factories. It's also a time of cultural change. This is the time when radio began to be something that lots of people had in their houses. Now, they weren't tiny little radios like we have today. They were giant pieces of furniture. We'll watch a Georgia Stories about the first radio station in Georgia, WSB. Um, Georgians, through radio, became more aware of the rest of the world. Before radio, you basically had to be literate to keep up with what was going on in the world or know somebody who could read newspapers. Well, radio changed that, and so even people who were not well educated, if they could get access to a radio, they were aware of what was going on in the world. This is the time period of early silent movies and eventually talkies. One of the most famous comedy duos of the time period was Laurel and Hardy. Oliver Hardy, that's him in the bowler hat, was from Harlem, Georgia. They were incredibly famous during the time period. Another new thing was dating for young people. Before the 1920s, there was no such thing. We'll talk in class about how young men and women um, dated before this time. They didn't even call it dating. We'll talk about how they did that. Um, Music was changing. Ma Rainey from Columbus was active during this time period. She's called the mother of the blues. Jazz is a growing American art form during this time period. Now, it's also a time of political change. Politically, people are very conservative. New political leaders are emerging in Georgia. One of them is Richard Russell Jr., who was elected to the Georgia House in 1920. He was governor in 1930 and afterwards was elected to the U.S. Senate and served for 40 years. That's a very long time. One of the other main politicians of this time period was Eugene Talmadge, called the Wild Man from Sugar Creek. He was very popular with farmers. We'll talk about his politics and how he campaigned and who he appealed to. We've talked about this being a period of change. Well, there were people who were very, very resistant to all of these changes. One of the most conservative organizations in the state was the KKK, which, you know, from the last chapter had appeared again around 1915 in the trial of Leo Frank. Fear of modernization, rapid change, new immigrants made those who believed in the old ways want to control society. They wanted to stop all those changes. Their targets were African Americans, Catholics, Jews, and basically any whites who didn't agree with the Klan's idea of what was morally correct. Through intimidation and violence, the Klan tried to keep everyone in their proper place. By 1920, the Klan had spread to all 48 states. In 1922, Clifford Walker, a politician with Klan ties, was elected governor of Georgia. He was elected with Klan ties, and people knew that he had them. He was elected governor of Georgia. But by 1930, Klan membership was down to 1,500 people in Georgia. It really grew a great deal during the 1920s, but by 1930 had practically almost disappeared. One of the people who spoke out against the Klan of the 1920s was the editor of the Columbus Inquirer, Julian Harris. He published stories about Klan violence, and he published the names of public officials who were Klan members. He was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for this, or the Ledger was, in 1926.